So Constantine what he does that's very important is that he makes Christianity the official religion of Rome. So before Constantine, you had Christian emperors, but they did not make Christianity the official religion. But he made Christianity the official religion. Okay? The problem, though, we discussed this last class, is that Christianity is a franchise model. So different churches teach different things. And so Constantine was like, no, we can't have this debate. If we'll make this the official religion, what we need to do is have one orthodoxy, a unified ideology, okay? All right, so at this time in history, there are two major debates, or two major sources of confusion. The first is what we call Christology. What this is the question of like, what's the nature of Jesus? Okay. Remember, the story is that Jesus is in heaven, then he comes to earth. Mary gives birth to Jesus, then Jesus preaches his message, the gospel, then he is killed and he is resurrected. And then he returns to heaven, okay? That's the official story of Christianity. But there are lots of problems with the story, as you can imagine. If Jesus is divine, how did Mary give birth to Jesus? Right? If you're a human woman and you give birth to a God, that means that you're God yourself, okay? All right, so who is Mary and what is her power? Second question then is Jesus divine or is he human? Okay? Because if he's human, he dies, that's a sacrifice, right? But if you're divine, you can't die, so his death and his resurrection doesn't make any sense. Okay? So this is the problem with Christology. Is Jesus human or is he divine? And there are different interpretations, okay? The first interpretation is Jesus is divine in heaven, but he's human in the world. Okay, does that make sense? So yes, Mary gave birth to Jesus, but she gave birth to the human Jesus and not the divine Jesus. Because you cannot give birth to the divine God, okay? And that's why his death makes sense, because the Jesus who died was the human Jesus, but once he died and he was resurrected, then he went to heaven, okay? That's one explanation, that Jesus is really human. Another explanation is, no, Jesus is divine. So Mary, the death doesn't really matter, okay? He's just divine, okay? So both are possibilities. What the church says officially is Jesus is human and divine at the same time, okay? This is the official ideology of the church. This makes no sense, guys, all right? But that's what you're taught. And so there are a lot of, course, people who are like, this is a stupid idea, okay? And these people are called the Nestorians. And they were persecuted by the Catholic Church. And so they went to Persia, okay? They went to the Middle East, they went to Persia, they went to Arabia, where they spread the message of Jesus. They taught Jesus as a human as opposed to a God. They taught that Jesus was a messenger, okay? Which is what I taught you, right? That he's really a messenger of the monad. All right? So, does that make sense? Okay. Now the second debate is actually even more confusing than the first debate, okay? And it has to do with the nature of the three powerful forces, right? The three gods. You have God, the ultimate God, then you have Jesus, then you have the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit is God expressed in the world. Okay, so when someone speaks to you, you think it's God. It's actually not God, it's the Holy Spirit. All right, so now the question then is, what is the relationship between these three? God, Jesus, and Holy Spirit. And again, there are different explanations. And they kind of make sense, okay? So the first is the idea of modalism. Modalism is the idea that Jesus and God and the Holy Spirit are just different modes of the same thing. They just change. So when Jesus is in heaven, he's God. When Jesus comes to earth as a human, he's just Jesus. And then when Jesus wants to communicate with us, he's the Holy Spirit, okay? So remember, Paul talked to Jesus. But Paul didn't really talk to Jesus. Paul talked to the Holy Spirit. Okay, so it's the same force, but expressed differently. Okay, that makes sense, right? Second is the idea of partialism. Partialism is just the idea that God, Jesus, the Holy Spirit are all part of the same divine force. Okay, so think of an ocean, right? The Pacific Ocean. The Pacific Ocean is huge, but there are different parts to it, right? So that's the idea of partialism. That makes sense too, right? Okay. And the third idea is the idea of Arianism. Arianism. And Arianism is just the idea that God came first, and then afterwards he created Jesus. So, in other words, Jesus is God, but he's second to the real God. Okay? That makes sense as well, right? Now, there are problems with all three, okay? The first problem, modalism, is if you read the Bible, Jesus talks to God, Jesus talks to the Holy Spirit. That's kind of confusing, because why would Jesus talk to himself, okay? So there's a lot of inconsistencies in the Bible. Okay, so this doesn't really work. Partialism doesn't work either, because if you think about it, if God, Jesus, and Holy Spirit are part of a divine aspect, then that divine aspect should be God, right? Not these three. Okay, this doesn't really make sense. And Arianism doesn't really make sense because the entire point of Christianity is to say that Jesus is God, right? We worship Jesus, not God. So if you're saying that God's superior, why shouldn't we worship God instead of Jesus? Okay? So this is problematic as well. So what Constantine did was he organized all the bishops of the different churches to come to Nicaea. It's called the Council of Nicaea. Okay? In order to come up with a solution to this problem. And this solution is actually even more problematic than these three, okay? And it's called the Holy Trinity. So let's go over the Holy Trinity. What the Holy Trinity says is this: God, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit, they are separate, okay? But they are equal. They are separate, but they're part of the same thing. Okay? They're both separate, and they are equal to each other. Okay? Now, if you think about it, it makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. The only solution to this problem is that this Holy Trinity is both nothing and everything at the same time. It becomes reality on to itself. Okay? And the only way to understand this is to accept this as a reality. Right? So I know there's confusion, but think of the idea of money, right? Okay, so the idea of money is both nothing and everything. Okay, money is nothing, but it can be everything at the same time as well, because it symbolizes wealth. Okay, does that make sense? All right. So none of this actually makes any sense. And the only way that it makes sense is if you force it to make sense, if you just memorize it. So think of math class, okay? Guys, I'm not sure if you appreciate this, but the entire point of math class is to make you stupid. Okay? Why? Because it is impossible for you to reason using mathematics, because mathematics doesn't really apply to the world. So the only thing that you can do is just memorize the formulas and apply the formulas to each other. Okay? And that just requires massive memorization and regurgitation. That's why, if you think about it, the best mathematicians are always in their 20s or 30s, because your brain has to be like really energetic in order to process this information. But the older you get, the less capable you are in mathematics. Okay? Does that make sense? This is really important, guys. The more math you learn, the stupider you become. Okay? But this goes against, say, philosophy or teaching, right? The older you get, the wiser you become. Why? Because the information that you're learning, you can apply to reality, and then figure out what information makes sense as you test this information against reality, okay? All right. Okay. So then the question then is, why would they do this? And the answer is very simple: to make you stupid. Okay. So let's just use an analogy. Let's do a thought experiment. The sky is blue, right? So we know the sky is blue, and now we're like, okay, why is the sky blue? And is it always blue? And why are certain things blue? Okay. From this very principle, the sky is blue, you can now start to ask more questions. You can, based on this idea, start to reason out more things, okay? Does that make sense? But let's just say, I change and I say, the sky is red. You're like, no, the sky is blue. I'm saying, no, the sky is red. If you do not say the sky is red, you are a heretic. I will burn you at the stake. And you're like, okay, all right. So what you're saying is this. You're saying that blue is red, red is blue. And I'm like, no. Blue is blue, red is red. The sky is red. And you're like, that makes no sense. I'm just like, okay, well then I don't care. Because if you do not say the sky is red, I will burn you at the stake. Okay, I will fail you in school. Okay, do you understand? So another way of saying this is, your brain, the way it processes information is by using logic, right? Okay, so think about a building. Think about a building. Okay? Think of a building. Okay? Well, this makes sense, right? You're just stacking blocks on top of each other to build a building, right? But let's just say I say no, this is what the building looks like. Okay, this is empty. You're like, well, that makes no sense. Okay? So what I've done by forcing the idea of the Holy Trinity onto you is I've basically taken a part of your logical system, of your brain, and emptied it out. So it's impossible for you to connect things, okay? Because from this, what you can do is say, oh, now I can just keep on building more things, right? But if the principle is there's a layer that is unseen or unknowable, you can't build on top of it. Okay? So your brain ceases to be able to process and be creative. Okay? Does that make sense? Yeah?
And I saw people who learn math well and also they have strong ability in computer science. They all work in Silicon Valley and they are wealthy. But I think that also aligns our concept that they are pursuing the materialistic and they are, the world is ruled by Satan. Is that true?
Yeah. Okay. We'll talk about this later. Okay. But yeah, if you work in Silicon Valley, you are a materialistic person who is incapable of thinking spiritually. Yes, that is correct. Also remember that people who do computer engineering and do mathematics, they're at the best in their 20s and 30s. By the time they reach over 40, they kind of burn out, okay? Because, for your brain to process all this, it eventually burns out, okay? Does that make sense? So again, I hate to say this, but math makes you stupid, all right? All right. Is that clear, guys? Any questions? Okay, but as you can